The contract wedding. The spring air outside the Harrington estate shimmered with warmth, but inside the marble halls of the great mansion, a storm was quietly brewing. Eleanor Reed clutched the envelope that had arrived that morning, her fingers trembling as she read the elegant gold-stamped letter for the 5th time. It bore the signature of Alexander Harrington, one of the wealthiest businessmen in the city, the man whose decisions could shape entire markets. And it carried words that made her heart pound with disbelief and fear. It was not an invitation. It was a proposal, a formal, legal, emotionless document offering marriage in exchange for the salvation of her family's dying company. Her father, a once proud architect who had built half the skyline, had fallen into bankruptcy after a series of failed investments, and now, with debts mounting and reputation collapsing, the offer on that paper seemed like the only rope thrown to a drowning family. Eleanor read again the final line that sealed her fate. The union shall ensure the stabilization of both parties' holdings and must take place within 30 days. There were no words of affection, no warmth, just cold business logic written in perfect font. Her mother's weary voice echoed from the kitchen, reminding her that they had no other choice. If she refused, their home would be taken, her father would face ruin, and the company her late grandfather had built with his bare hands would vanish from existence. Eleanor had dreamed of love since she was a girl, the kind that lit novels on fire and made songs worth singing. But those dreams now dissolved like mist under harsh daylight. The Harrington name carried both salvation and destruction, and accepting meant stepping into a life of wealth built on duty, not affection. When she was escorted to the Harrington mansion for the meeting, she expected to see Alexander, the eldest son, but instead met his father, Richard Harrington, a man whose silver hair and commanding voice filled the room with quiet authority. He regarded her as if measuring her worth in silence. Then, without preamble, he said, "My son Alexander will marry you. This union is necessary. You will be taken care of, but understand this. Miss Reed, there will be expectations." Eleanor had wanted to ask what expectations meant, but her father's grateful handshake with Richard ended the conversation before it began. Later, when she met Alexander for the first time, she understood. He stood by the grand piano, tall and coldly beautiful, his eyes a piercing gray that revealed nothing but disdain. He did not offer his hand. He only glanced at her like someone forced to examine a product he never intended to buy. "Let's get this over with," he said. "I don't do love and I don't play house. You'll have everything you need, but don't expect anything from me." Each word struck like frost across her heart. Yet she lifted her chin and met his gaze, refusing to let him see her tremble. "I'm not here to beg for affection, Mr. Harrington. I'm here because duty sometimes demands sacrifice." For a brief second, surprise flickered across his face, but then the wall returned, and he simply nodded. The days that followed moved in a blur of preparations she did not choose. Designers fitted her with gowns worth more than her father's company. Florists filled the cathedral with imported roses. Photographers hovered to capture images of a perfect fairy tale couple that existed only for the public eye. Alexander never smiled in any photo. He appeared beside her like a marble statue, elegant, flawless, and lifeless. Yet every night Eleanor reminded herself of why she was doing this, to save her family, to give her parents peace, to prove that dignity could survive even in the shadow of humiliation. Her best friend Clara tried to convince her to run away, to forget the Harringtons and start anew somewhere else. But Eleanor knew reality didn't allow romantic escapes. She had seen her father's silent shame, her mother's anxious hands counting unpaid bills. Love was a luxury they could no longer afford. The morning of the wedding arrived beneath a pale gold sky. Reporters swarmed outside St. Augustine Cathedral, flashes of cameras reflecting off the polished black limousines that lined the street. Inside, the choir rehearsed softly while guests, politicians, executives, and celebrities, filled the pews. Eleanor stood in a quiet side chamber, her white gown a cascade of silk and pearls. Her mother adjusted the veil with trembling fingers. "You look like a dream," she whispered, but tears glimmered in her eyes. Eleanor forced a small smile. "Dreams end when you wake, Mama. Let's just hope this one lasts long enough." Then the doors opened, and the wedding coordinator signaled that it was time. When she walked down the aisle, the crowd gasped in awe. The chandeliers glowed like captured starlight, The flowers perfumed the air, and at the far end stood Alexander in his black suit, handsome as sin and twice as distant. She tried to meet his eyes, searching for some trace of kindness, but found only impatience. As she reached him, the priest began his blessings, his voice echoing through the vast cathedral. Everything seemed surreal. The murmurs, the music, the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. Then, when the priest asked Alexander to take Eleanor as his wife, the impossible happened. Alexander chuckled softly, a cruel, bitter sound that rippled through the hushed congregation. "I'll take her, Father," he said loudly enough for all to hear, "because my father insists, not because I want her." A wave of whispers swept across the pews. Eleanor froze, her face burning behind the veil, her breath caught somewhere between shame and disbelief. Her mother gasped. Her father looked as though the earth had tilted beneath him. The priest hesitated, his tone faltering, but Alexander continued, "Let's not pretend this is a love story. It's a contract, and she gets security, I get silence, and my father gets a reputation repaired. Everyone wins." For a long, dreadful second the world stood still. Then the flashbulbs erupted like lightning. Eleanor felt her heart crack, but she didn't cry. She turned to the priest and said quietly, "Please continue." Her voice was steady, though every word tasted like glass. When the ceremony ended, applause rose hesitantly, polite, confused, empty. Alexander brushed past her without even looking back, heading toward the waiting cameras outside. Eleanor remained in the aisle, surrounded by whispers, until she felt a gentle hand on her shoulder. When she turned, she met the warm brown eyes of a man she hadn't noticed before, Alexander's younger brother, Nathan Harrington. He looked nothing like his brother. Softer features, sincere gaze, kindness written into every line of his expression. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. His voice meant only for her. "You didn't deserve that." And for the first time that day, someone's words didn't sting. She nodded silently, not trusting her voice, and he guided her away from the staring eyes through a side door, into the quiet garden where sunlight filtered through rose-covered arches. In that hidden place, away from reporters and gossiping guests, Eleanor finally let herself breathe. Nathan stood beside her without speaking, offering his handkerchief but no pity. After a while, he said softly, "He wasn't always like this, you know. Alexander used to be human, but the world changes people when they believe money can buy everything." Eleanor looked up, her eyes wet but fierce. "I don't hate him," she whispered. "I just hate that I let myself believe this could be different." Nathan smiled sadly. "You're stronger than he'll ever understand." Then he looked toward the church doors where Alexander was posing for photographs with a fake smile and a champagne glass. "He might have humiliated you today, but I think he'll regret it. Some people learn too late what grace looks like." Eleanor said nothing. The only sound was the wind through the roses, soft, forgiving, eternal. That night, the headlines burned across every social feed. Billionaire groom publicly shames bride at lavish wedding, and contract marriage scandal rocks the Harrington empire. Eleanor sat alone in the cold expanse of her new penthouse suite, staring out over the glittering skyline. Her phone buzzed endlessly with calls she ignored. Alexander was nowhere to be found. Rumors said he had left for a business trip to Monaco within hours of the ceremony. The city mocked her. The tabloids feasted, yet deep inside, beneath the pain and humiliation, a quiet resolve began to form. She had entered this marriage for duty, but she would not live it in shame. If Alexander wanted indifference, she would give him dignity. If he gave her distance, she would build purpose. The world would see not a broken bride, but a woman who rose from the ashes of humiliation with her head held high. In the days that followed, as gossip flared and faded, Nathan Harrington visited her often under the guise of family courtesy. He brought her updates from the company, small comforts like books and coffee, and an easy companionship that didn't feel like charity. They talked about everything except Alexander. Eleanor found herself smiling again, though cautiously, and Nathan seemed to sense the fragile strength growing in her. He once told her, "Sometimes the people forced into the darkest corners end up shining the brightest." Maybe that's your story, Eleanor. She didn't answer, but that night when she wrote in her journal, she found herself praying that he might be right. What none of them knew, not Alexander, not Richard, not even Eleanor herself, was that the cruel scene at the altar was not the end of her humiliation, but the beginning of something far greater. For in the silence that followed disgrace, love was quietly being born, not out of pity, but from the courage of two hearts that refused to let cruelty define them. And as the city whispered about the cold billionaire's sham marriage, a single act of compassion in a garden would soon grow into a storm powerful enough to change all their lives forever. The lonely penthouse, the days after the wedding, stretched like a cold winter that refused to end. Eleanor awoke each morning to the soft hum of the city below her penthouse windows, but the silence within those marble walls felt heavier than any storm. The luxury surrounding her was suffocating. Gold-framed mirrors, white orchids in crystal vases, the faint scent of expensive perfume that never quite hid the emptiness. She would sit by the vast window, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise ignite the glass towers in the distance, and wonder how her life had become something that looked perfect from the outside yet hollow within. The tabloids still whispered her name. The gossip pages called her the bride of shame, mocking her calm composure on the altar as if her dignity were a costume. She refused to read them, but her phone buzzed relentlessly with messages from curious acquaintances and former colleagues from the school, where she once taught art to children. They all wanted to know the same thing: why she stayed, why she didn't walk away from a man who had humiliated her before the entire city. The truth was simple and cruel. She had no contract allowing her to leave. The arrangement was legal, binding, and tied to her family's financial survival. Breaking it would destroy them, and so she endured, her silence becoming both shield and prison. Alexander had not returned since the wedding. Rumors placed him in Monaco, then London, then some private island with investors and models whose names she didn't care to remember. Every night she set a dinner table for two out of habit, only to clear it alone. The staff, polite, efficient, and trained never to intrude, moved through the apartment like ghosts, tending to her needs without question. Her only moments of warmth came from Nathan's visits. He never announced himself through assistants or chauffeurs. He simply appeared, carrying something thoughtful: a box of homemade cookies from his mother's old recipe, or a stack of books he thought she might love. "You need something alive in this place," he said once, setting a small potted lavender plant on her balcony. "Something that doesn't care about money or appearances." That simple gesture had meant more than all the diamonds Alexander's family could afford. Nathan was everything his brother wasn't: approachable, quietly humorous, and profoundly human. Where Alexander's presence filled a room with tension, Nathan brought warmth that settled the air. He was an architect, though he refused to work under the Harrington name. "I design things that people actually live in," he explained one evening over tea, his eyes glinting with quiet pride. "Not glass monuments to ego." Eleanor admired that about him: his refusal to chase power, his belief that worth wasn't measured in profit margins. Slowly, without meaning to, her afternoons began to revolve around his visits. Sometimes they would talk about art or music. Sometimes they would simply sit on the terrace watching the city lights shimmer beneath the dusk sky. He never mentioned Alexander unless she did first, and even then his words carried no bitterness, only resignation. "He's been lost since our mother died," Nathan said softly one night, staring into the dark. Father turned grief into ambition. Alex turned it into rebellion. Eleanor listened, realizing for the first time that behind the cold arrogance of Alexander Harrington lay something wounded, a boy crushed beneath expectations and fear. It didn't excuse his cruelty, but it explained the shadows in his eyes. She wanted to hate him completely, yet her heart wouldn't allow it. "I think pain makes people build walls," she said quietly. "The higher they build, the lonelier they become." Nathan looked at her then, and something unspoken passed between them. A fragile recognition of shared loneliness. Two souls standing in different prisons built by the same family. From that evening their bond deepened. Not through grand confessions or stolen touches, but through small acts of understanding. He once found her in the kitchen trying to cook and joined her without a word, rolling up his sleeves and laughing when the sauce nearly boiled over. The sound of his laughter filled the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. And for the first time since the wedding, Eleanor laughed too. A real, unguarded sound that startled even her. Meanwhile, Alexander's absence became the city's favorite scandal. Headlines screamed about his reckless nights, his rumored affairs, and the company's stock fluctuations. Richard Harrington tried to control the damage, but the family name began to tremble under the weight of gossip. In public, Eleanor remained poised. She attended charity events, spoke at educational foundations, and used her new platform to fund programs for underprivileged children, a quiet rebellion against the shallow world that had mocked her. Reporters started calling her the graceful bride, and public sympathy shifted. She turned her humiliation into purpose, her silence into strength. Even Richard, who had once regarded her as a convenient solution, began to see her differently. "You have the kind of dignity money can't buy," he told her at a gala, pride flickering in his eyes. But it was Nathan who saw the toll it took on her heart. The long night staring out at the skyline. The way she touched her wedding ring absent-mindedly, as if trying to remember why she wore it, one stormy night. As thunder rolled over the city, Alexander finally returned. Eleanor heard the sound of his key in the door and a chill ran through her. When he entered the penthouse, drenched from the rain and smelling of whiskey, she stood waiting in the hallway, unsure whether to greet him as a wife or stranger. His eyes were cold but unreadable. "So this is the perfect life you wanted?" he asked bitterly, throwing his coat onto a chair. "Living in a cage built of my father's guilt?" She met his glare without fear. "I never wanted your cage," she replied calmly. "But since you left me here, I've learned how to live in it with grace." He laughed, a sharp sound full of disbelief. "Grace doesn't change what this is, Eleanor. You're here because of a deal. Don't fool yourself into thinking it's anything more." The cruelty in his voice cut deep, but she refused to let him see it. "And you," she said softly, "are still the man who mistakes pride for strength." He froze, startled by her composure, and for a brief second the mask slipped. She saw something like regret flicker in his expression before he turned away. "I'm going to the study," he muttered, disappearing behind the heavy oak door. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. The storm outside raged, lightning flashing across the city, and somewhere in the darkness she heard the faint sound of Alexander pacing. She almost pitied him, almost, but the ache in her chest reminded her that pity was dangerous. It could turn into something that trapped her heart again. The next morning, she found the study empty, a half-finished glass of whiskey on the desk and a flight itinerary to Switzerland lying open. He was leaving again. This time she didn't ask why. She simply gathered the courage to sign her name on the charity papers that would officially launch the Bennett Education Trust. Named after her late grandmother, it was her way of reclaiming her identity, proof that she was more than a bride bought by a business empire. A few weeks later, during the launch event for the foundation, she spotted Nathan across the room talking with donors. When their eyes met, something wordless passed between them. Pride, relief, maybe even tenderness. After the speeches, he approached her with a small smile. "You've built something beautiful," he said. "Your grandmother would be proud." She hesitated before replying, her voice soft but firm. "I just wanted to prove that even broken beginnings can create something meaningful." Nathan nodded slowly. "Maybe some beginnings aren't broken," he said. "Maybe they're just waiting for the right person to see the cracks as part of the design." His words lingered long after he left. That night, standing on the balcony, Eleanor looked up at the stars and felt something new stirring inside her. Not longing for Alexander's approval, but gratitude for her own resilience, and for the quiet man who had helped her find it. But peace in the Harrington family never lasted. One morning, Eleanor woke to a call from Richard's assistant summoning her urgently to the main estate. When she arrived, the air was thick with tension. Richard stood by the fireplace, pale and weary, holding a newspaper. The headline screamed, "Harrington Brothers Feud Leaks to Press. Insider Claims Betrayal and Jealousy Behind the Empire's Walls." Beneath it were photos of Nathan and Eleanor at her foundation gala, their smiles frozen in a moment the tabloids twisted into scandal. "I know the truth," Richard said quietly, "but the world won't care. They see what they want to see." Eleanor's heart sank. "Nathan has done nothing wrong," she protested, but Richard's expression darkened. "Alexander sees betrayal in everything. He's already on his way home, and I fear this time words won't heal what's coming." That night, Eleanor returned to the penthouse feeling the old anxiety return, the fear of being judged, misunderstood, trapped in a narrative not her own. She poured herself tea and waited by the window, knowing Alexander would appear soon. His anger as predictable as thunder before rain. Yet somewhere deep inside she no longer trembled. The woman who had been humiliated at the altar was gone, In her place stood someone tempered by solitude and purpose, someone ready to face the storm head-on. The door opened at midnight. Alexander stepped inside, his jaw tight, the newspaper crushed in his hand. The silence stretched between them, charged with everything unspoken. "Care to explain this?" he demanded. Eleanor looked at him, her voice steady as a heartbeat. "Explain what? That your brother treated me with kindness when you offered me humiliation, that he listened when you vanished? If that offends you, perhaps the problem isn't the picture. It's your reflection in it." For a moment, Alexander said nothing. Then, without warning, he slammed the newspaper onto the table and turned away, his shoulders tense with something that looked almost like shame. "You don't understand," he muttered. "You think this world forgives weakness. It doesn't." Eleanor took a step closer, her tone gentle but unyielding. "No, Alexander. It doesn't forgive cruelty either." The words hung between them, heavy and final. He didn't answer. He simply walked into the storm outside, leaving the door wide open as rain spilled across the marble floor. Eleanor stood there for a long time, the city's thunder echoing her heartbeat. Somewhere beyond the clouds, dawn was waiting. She didn't know what the next day would bring, confrontation, redemption, or another wound. But she knew this. She would no longer be silent. Whatever came next, she would face it not as the girl who was humiliated, but as the woman who refused to break. The brothers' confession. Morning came wrapped in silver mist, and the city below Eleanor's balcony seemed suspended in quiet uncertainty. After the storm the night before, the penthouse felt colder than ever, its walls echoing with the memory of harsh words and unspoken pain. She stood barefoot by the window, watching the sunrise slowly wash the skyline in pale gold, her reflection faint in the glass, the image of a woman both fragile and fierce, carrying the weight of choices she had never asked to make. She had thought humiliation was the worst pain she would endure, but she now knew there were deeper wounds, ones that came not from public scorn, but from private loneliness. Yet within that loneliness something unexpected had begun to grow, a faint warmth that had nothing to do with Alexander and everything to do with Nathan. His voice, his patience, his way of seeing her not as a problem to be solved, but as a person who deserved peace. Later that morning, her phone rang. It was Nathan, his voice calm but tinged with urgency. "Can we meet? Somewhere away from all this noise." She agreed without hesitation, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. They chose a small cafe tucked behind an art gallery, one of those quiet places where time seemed to slow down. When she arrived, Nathan was already there, seated by the window, dressed simply but elegantly. His expression softened when he saw her. "You look tired," he said gently. "I'm fine," she replied, though they both knew it wasn't true. The waiter brought coffee, and for a while they said nothing, listening instead to the hum of the city outside and the faint jazz playing in the background. It was Nathan who finally broke the silence. "I should have protected you better," he said, his voice low. "I should have stopped Alexander from—" She shook her head. "You did more than anyone had to. You gave me kindness when I was drowning. That's more protection than anyone else offered." Nathan looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers as if weighing whether to speak the words he'd been holding back for weeks. "Eleanor," he began slowly, "I know what people are saying. About us, about that picture. And I know how much it hurts to be dragged through lies, but I need you to know something before it gets twisted any further. My feelings for you?" He hesitated, then exhaled. "They're real. I didn't plan them, I didn't want them, but they're there. You've changed the way I see everything. You've reminded me that goodness still exists even in the middle of all this chaos." Eleanor's breath caught. For a second, she could only stare at him, her heart torn between gratitude and fear. "Nathan," she whispered, "please don't say that. You know how complicated this is." He nodded, pain flickering in his eyes. "I know, I'm not asking you for anything. I just couldn't keep pretending that what I feel is just sympathy. When I see you hurting, I want to make it stop. When you smile, it feels like the world finally makes sense again. But I also know that my brother still holds your name on paper, even if he's never earned your heart." Her hands trembled as she set down her coffee cup. "You've been the only light in all this," she said quietly. "But if anyone knew—" "They already think they do," Nathan interrupted softly. "But their version doesn't matter. What matters is that you know I see you. Not the scandal, not the title, just you." For a long time, neither of them spoke. Outside, rain began to fall again, soft and rhythmic against the glass. It was the kind of moment that should have ended with a confession, a touch, a surrender. But Eleanor knew that love, when bound by guilt, could turn into another kind of prison. She rose slowly, gathering her bag. "Thank you for being honest," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But please don't destroy yourself because of me. I've caused enough damage just by existing in this family." Nathan stood too, blocking her path with a quiet desperation that broke her heart. "You haven't caused anything," he said firmly. "You walked into a storm that wasn't yours and somehow became the only person holding it together. You don't owe anyone an apology for surviving." She met his gaze, her throat tight, and then, without another word, walked out into the rain. Back at the penthouse, she found Alexander waiting. He was sitting by the fireplace, staring into the flames, his face drawn and pale. The newspaper with their photo lay on the table beside him. "So," he said without looking up, "it's true then. My brother is in love with my wife." His tone wasn't angry. It was hollow, exhausted. Eleanor stood still, her pulse quickening. "Nathan is your brother," she said quietly. "And I am your wife only on paper. You made sure of that." He looked up sharply. "Don't play the martyr, Eleanor. You think the world will pity you because you stood at that altar and smiled while I spoke the truth? You knew what this was." She took a step forward, her eyes burning. "No, Alexander. I thought I did. I thought it was a transaction, cold and clear. But what I didn't expect was that I'd end up being more human than you ever tried to be." Something in his expression cracked, and for the first time since their wedding, she saw emotion, not anger, but confusion, sorrow, maybe even shame. "You don't understand what it's like," he muttered. "To grow up being told that love is weakness, that feelings destroy empires. My father made sure we learned that lesson before we learned how to speak." She looked at him for a long moment, her heart softening despite everything. "And did it make you happy? Has power filled the emptiness your heart keeps running from?" He didn't answer. He just turned his gaze back to the fire. "You should go," he said finally, his voice almost breaking. "Before I say something I can't take back." That night, Eleanor couldn't stop thinking about both brothers. One hardened by pride, the other softened by compassion. Two men born under the same name, walking opposite paths that somehow both led to her. She wrote in her journal until dawn, her words tumbling like confessions to a God she wasn't sure was listening. "If love is a sin in their world," she wrote, "then kindness must be its rebellion." The next day brought chaos. News broke that Alexander's reckless deals overseas had triggered a financial scandal, threatening the Harrington empire. Investors panicked, reporters swarmed, and Richard suffered a minor collapse from the stress. Eleanor rushed to the hospital where she found Nathan already at his father's bedside, exhaustion written across his face. Alexander was there too, standing in the corner, silent and guilt-stricken. When Richard opened his eyes, the first thing he said was, "Fix it. Together." For once, the two brothers exchanged a look that wasn't rivalry but shared fear. After the doctors left, Nathan turned to Eleanor. "You should go home and rest. This isn't your burden," she shook her head. "It became mine the day your family put my name beside yours. I'm not walking away now." The next few days blurred into sleepless nights. Eleanor helped coordinate meetings, manage statements, and faced the press with composure that stunned even the family's publicists. While Alexander struggled to contain the business damage, Nathan became her quiet partner behind the scenes. They worked side by side until dawn, surviving on coffee and determination. There were moments, brief, dangerous moments, and when their hands brushed as they exchanged files or when exhaustion made them laugh at nothing, and the air between them grew heavy with unspoken longing. But every time it happened, Eleanor forced herself to remember the promise she had made to herself, that she would not be the cause of another betrayal. When the crisis finally eased, Richard was stable, the company recovering, and Alexander more subdued than she had ever seen him. He approached her one evening in the study, his eyes shadowed. "You saved my family's name," he said quietly. "I should thank you, but gratitude isn't something I was ever good at." Eleanor looked up from the papers. "Don't thank me, Alexander. Just stop running from yourself." He gave a bitter smile. "Easier said than done." Then, after a long pause, he added, "Nathan cares about you. I can see it. I don't blame him. You make people believe they can still be good." Her heart clenched at his words because they carried both admiration and defeat. "And what about you?" she asked softly. "Do you believe that?" He hesitated, then whispered, "I don't know how." The air between them was thick with everything they might have been if the world had been different. But before she could reply, Nathan entered the room. The tension was immediate. 3 hearts tied by duty, guilt, and love. Alexander looked between them, then exhaled slowly. "Maybe my father was right," he murmured. "Maybe I was never built for love." He left without another word, his footsteps fading down the hall. Nathan stared after him, his face pale. "He's breaking," he said, "and I don't know how to help him anymore." Eleanor touched his arm gently. "You already have, Nathan. Sometimes love isn't about saving someone. It's about showing them they can choose a different path." That night, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the city, the distance between them felt smaller than ever. The moon cast a soft glow across the skyline, painting everything in silver. Nathan turned to her, his voice barely a whisper. "If I told you that you deserved more than this life, would you believe me?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "I don't need more, Nathan. I just need truth." He took a step closer, his gaze steady and full of emotion. "And here it is. I love you. I know it's wrong, I know it's complicated, but I can't keep pretending it isn't real. You've become the best part of my world, and I would give everything, even the family name, just to see you free." For a moment, the world stood still. The city lights blurred, the wind caught her veil of hair, and all she could hear was the pounding of her heart. She wanted to say it back, to tell him that somewhere in the ruins of her arranged marriage, her heart had quietly chosen him. But before she could speak, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them, Alexander's voice cutting through the fragile silence. "So it's true." His tone wasn't furious. It was hollow, wounded, resigned. He stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his coat, his eyes reflecting both betrayal and heartbreak. "I thought I had nothing left to lose," he said softly. "But apparently I was wrong." Then he turned and walked away into the darkness, leaving them frozen beneath the indifferent moonlight, both knowing that everything had just changed forever. The fall of the empire. The Harrington estate had always been a symbol of power, wealth, and unshakable control, but now, as autumn's chill settled over the city, the empire that had ruled boardrooms and headlines began to crack under the weight of its own secrets. The financial scandal Alexander had tried to contain had become wildfire, spreading through the markets with brutal precision. Reporters camped outside the mansion gates, cameras flashing, drones hovering over the gardens that once hosted galas and royal guests. Inside those walls, the family that had once commanded respect stood on the edge of ruin. Eleanor sat in the library, surrounded by silent portraits of generations of Harringtons, each face carved in oil and arrogance. She had been called everything from the savior wife to the scandal bride, but none of those titles felt real to her anymore. What she felt was exhaustion, not the kind that came from sleepless nights, but the kind that came from fighting battles she never chose. Nathan had left early that morning to deal with panicked investors, and Alexander had locked himself in the study again, drowning in paperwork, whiskey, and guilt. Richard, too frail to intervene, had withdrawn into silence, his empire collapsing in the hands of the sons he'd raised to value control over compassion. The phone rang constantly with calls from journalists, lawyers, and business partners demanding answers, but Eleanor ignored them all. Instead, she turned her attention to the one thing that still gave her peace, her foundation. The Bennett Education Trust had become a quiet success amid the chaos. Schools were being renovated, children were receiving scholarships, and teachers wrote her letters of gratitude. In their simple, heartfelt words, she found the strength the Harrington mansion had long forgotten. It was ironic, she thought, that in saving others she had somehow begun to save herself. That afternoon, Nathan returned, his tie loosened, exhaustion etched across his face. "It's worse than we thought," he said quietly, setting down his briefcase. "Alexander's offshore accounts are under investigation, and the board wants to remove him as CEO." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. "And you?" she asked softly. Nathan hesitated. "They want me to take his place, temporarily." His tone carried no pride, only sadness. "He won't survive this, Eleanor. He's drowning, and for the first time, he knows it." She walked closer, her voice trembling with empathy. "Maybe losing everything will finally make him see what truly matters." Nathan nodded slowly, but his eyes searched hers, filled with the unspoken question that had been haunting them both. And what about us? Before she could answer, the heavy doors to the study slammed open. Alexander stood there, disheveled, eyes blazing with a fury born of desperation. "Congratulations, little brother," he said coldly. "You finally got what you wanted. My company, my father's approval, and my wife's heart." Nathan's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. "This isn't about me," he said calmly. "It's about saving what's left." Alexander laughed bitterly. "Save what? The empire my father built on manipulation and lies? Or the marriage that was nothing more than a business transaction?" His eyes turned to Eleanor, sharp and wounded. "Tell me, Eleanor, did you ever love me? Or was I just another project you thought you could fix?" The question sliced through the air. Eleanor's breath caught, and for a moment she couldn't speak. Then, with quiet dignity, she said, "I wanted to believe you could become the man you were meant to be, but love can't exist where cruelty lives. You killed it the day you humiliated me at the altar." Alexander's expression flickered. Pain, regret, pride, all colliding in silence. Then he turned to Nathan, voice trembling with bitterness. "And you? You stood by waiting for her to fall so you could catch her. Tell me, do you think that makes you better than me?" Nathan took a step forward, his tone firm but calm. "No, it makes me human." For a long moment, the brothers stared at each other, two men torn apart by the same woman, though neither truly blamed her. The weight of their family's history pressed down like a curse. Then Alexander turned and walked out, slamming the door so hard the glass trembled in its frame. Days blurred into nights. The news grew worse. Investors withdrew. Stocks fell. And the Harrington name, once spoken with reverence, now echoed in boardrooms as a cautionary tale. Eleanor found herself summoned to yet another emergency meeting at the company headquarters, this time not as a silent wife, but as the only person the public still trusted. When she entered the conference room filled with sharp suits and sharper tongues, the tension was palpable. One of the board members, an older man with a sneer of superiority, leaned forward. "Mrs. Harrington, perhaps you can convince your husband to step aside gracefully before this destroys what's left of us." She met his gaze without blinking. "Mr. Harrington doesn't listen to me," she said evenly. "He never has. But I will not let you blame everything on one man when this company's rot began long before him." Her voice carried a strength that silenced the room. Even Nathan, standing by the window, looked at her with awe. When the meeting ended, he approached her quietly. "You just did more for this family than any of us have in years," he said. She smiled faintly. "I just told the truth, something this family has avoided for too long." That evening, the family gathered at the estate for what Richard called a reckoning. The old man sat in his armchair, his once commanding voice now thin but still carrying authority. "This family forgot what it means to be honorable," he began. "We built an empire of glass and called it strength. Alexander, I forced you into power before you were ready. Eleanor, I forced you into marriage when you deserved choice. Nathan, I turned you into a shadow trying to outshine your brother. I was wrong. All of it was wrong." The silence that followed was unbearable. Alexander sat rigid, his hands clenched, eyes burning. "And what now?" he asked bitterly. "You want forgiveness?" Richard shook his head. "No, I want you to be free." The next morning, the newspapers exploded with the headline that stunned the city. "Alexander Harrington resigns as CEO, names brother as successor." Reporters gathered outside the mansion once again, this time not for scandal but for history. Nathan tried to avoid the spotlight, but he couldn't escape it. When he stepped out to make a statement, Eleanor stood beside him, calm and radiant in her simplicity. "The Harrington family is not its mistakes," Nathan told the cameras. "It's what we choose to become after them. This company will stand for people, not power." His words went viral within hours, sparking admiration from even their harshest critics. But inside the mansion, Alexander watched the broadcast in silence. When it ended, he poured himself a drink, then poured it down the drain instead. He stared at his reflection in the glass and saw not the powerful CEO he once was, but a man stripped bare, a man who had finally lost everything except his conscience. Later that night, he found Eleanor in the garden, tending to the lavender Nathan had given her months ago. "You always make dead things grow," he said quietly. She looked up, startled to find him there. "Sometimes they just need light," she replied softly. He nodded slowly, his voice almost breaking. I'm sorry, Eleanor. For the wedding, for the words, for all of it. She studied his face, searching for sincerity, and this time she found it. I forgave you a long time ago, she said gently. But forgiveness doesn't mean return. He smiled sadly. I know. I just needed to hear it once. He turned to leave, then paused. Take care of him, he added, meaning Nathan, though he couldn't say the name aloud. He's a better man than I ever was. When he was gone, Eleanor stood alone under the silver light of the moon, her heart aching not with anger but with compassion. She realized then that love didn't always end in romance, sometimes it ended in release. She looked toward the mansion where Nathan's light still glowed in the study window, and knew that her future, for the first time, was hers to choose. The new beginning, winter returned to the city quietly, without the glittering parades or champagne dinners that had once defined the Harrington calendar. Snow gathered along the ledges of the tall glass towers and softened the roar of traffic below, turning even the sleepless avenues into something almost peaceful. For the first time in years, the name Harrington no longer appeared on the front pages of financial tabloids, but in the back columns of community news. A foundation donation here, a new school opened there. The empire had survived, smaller and humbler but alive. And in its rebirth, Eleanor finally felt a sense of calm that no amount of luxury had ever given her. She still lived in the penthouse, though it no longer felt like a prison. The marble halls were filled with warmth now, shelves lined with children's drawings from her foundation schools, the scent of bread from the kitchen she had finally learned to use, a record player humming softly in the evenings. Nathan often came by after work, usually carrying blueprints rolled under one arm and groceries under the other. He would set the plans on the table and talk about his new vision for the company, a shift from skyscrapers to sustainable housing, from status to service. Eleanor listened, smiling, because his voice carried the hope she had once thought lost forever. One evening, as the firelight flickered across the room, Nathan poured her tea and sat beside her on the sofa. Outside, snow fell in slow spirals against the window. You know, he said quietly, when I was younger, I thought success meant owning more than anyone else. Now I think it means leaving something better behind. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes reflecting the fire. You already have, she said softly. You gave this family back its heart. He shook his head. You did that. You reminded us that compassion isn't weakness. There was a silence between them then, not awkward, but full, like the pause between two verses of a song. In those months, Alexander had disappeared from the public eye. No one knew exactly where he'd gone until a letter arrived addressed to Nathan in simple handwriting. Inside was a short note. Tell her the lavender's blooming again. Thank you for letting me fall far enough to see the ground. Enclosed was a photograph. Alexander standing beside a half-built school in a small village abroad, sleeves rolled up, eyes clear for the first time. Nathan showed it to Eleanor without a word. She traced the edges of the photo with her fingertips and smiled faintly. Maybe he finally found peace, she whispered. Nathan nodded. Maybe we all did. Spring came early that year. The city parks filled with new leaves, and the Bennett Education Trust held its first scholarship ceremony. Eleanor stood on the stage before rows of students, her voice steady as she told them that every story could change direction, that dignity was stronger than pride, and that kindness could rebuild anything broken. When she looked into the crowd, she saw Nathan standing near the back, hands in his pockets, eyes shining with quiet pride. In that moment, she understood that her journey had not been about surviving humiliation, but about discovering who she truly was. After the ceremony, they walked together along the river. The sun was setting, painting the water gold. Nathan stopped, turned to her, and said, You once told me you only needed truth, so here's mine. I want a life with you, not as a secret, not as a scandal, but as something real and simple. No contracts, no boardrooms, no shadows. Just us. Eleanor felt the wind lift her hair, and for the first time she didn't feel torn between duty and desire. She reached for his hand. There's nothing simple about love, she said. But maybe that's what makes it worth it. He smiled, and in his eyes she saw the promise of a future untainted by the past. Months later, they married quietly in a small garden behind the new school. No cameras, no reporters, only family, and the laughter of children echoing through the courtyard. Richard attended in a wheelchair, his eyes filled with tears he no longer hid. He whispered to Eleanor as he took her hand, "You saved my sons." She answered gently, "They saved themselves. I just believed they could." Nathan slipped the ring on her finger, and when he kissed her, the applause of the children sounded like the world beginning again. Years would pass before anyone called her the scandal bride again, and by then the title carried no sting. To most people, she became the woman who turned disgrace into grace, the teacher who rebuilt an empire's conscience. To Nathan, she was simply Eleanor, the heart that had taught him how to build not with steel and glass but with hope. And somewhere far away, on a hill scented with lavender, Alexander watched a sunrise over the school he'd helped finish and whispered to himself, "Finally." The city kept moving, as cities always do, but in the quiet spaces between its heartbeat, there lingered the echo of a story. Of a woman humiliated at the altar who chose dignity instead of despair. Of brothers learning that redemption and love are not opposites, and of an empire rebuilt not on power, but on humanity. Eleanor often said to her students later in life, "Don't be afraid when the world breaks you. That's how light gets in." And when she looked at the skyline glowing in the dusk, she knew she had lived that truth.